Welcome to another event from Y House. My name is Caleb Scharf, and I'm one of the founders of Y House. For those of you who don't know, Y House is a new nonprofit research institute here in New York, and our interests and focus is on the deep questions to do with the origins and nature of consciousness. That means everything from machines to bacteria to humans to societies to philosophy and more. But a big piece of what we do at Y House is building community. And so we have a program of public events, of which this is one in a series called Chasing Consciousness. If you were here in the fall at Caveat, you would have been to some of our earlier events in that series. We also hold events at our space here in the city for a thing called Consciousness Club, which is a little bit more informal. And I encourage you to go to our website. It's Y. Oh, the display has gone down. It's Y House with the letter Y, yhousenyc.org, and you can find out more details there. So it's my great pleasure to have you all here this evening for the first in this Chasing Consciousness in 2018, and we have some truly wonderful and special speakers tonight. What I'm going to do is hand off to the president of Y House, Pete Hutt, who will make those introductions. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Caleb. It is a great pleasure to introduce Robbert Dijkgraaf and Pia de Jong. Why don't you come sit here? Everybody can see you. And Robbert is the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, also known as the place where Einstein worked, and von Neumann and Gödel and many other famous people. And he's also my boss because I'm an astrophysicist, happen to work in the same place. Robbert and Pia are both going to talk about the power of imagination and what it is like to live different lives at the same time. Robbert has one part of his life as a physicist, and that is already very broad. He is working on string theory, but he's also writing books about popular physics, including experiments for elementary school children in physics. So when people say that string theory has nothing to do with experiments, here we have a counterexample going all the way across the different ages. But Robbert also has a professional background in art. He followed the Dutch Rietveld Academy, the most famous art academy in Holland. So he will talk about those two sides and how he combines that. And Pia similarly has a background as a psychologist, but then after doing that for quite a while, she started writing books, and she became an acclaimed novelist in Holland. They both lived in Holland until 5 years ago when they came here. And recently her latest novel has been translated in English, Saving Charlotte. And she will talk about her double background. So for the price of one ticket, you get 2 people with 4 careers. So it can't be better than that. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Pete, and well, warm welcome to all of you. I have a mic, yes. So I think we decided that I would start, then Pia will say something. Then we'll have a short conversation, the two of us, and then we hope to involve the audience. And I think for both of us, this is kind of an exceptional circumstance, because certainly often, you know, at these kind of occasions, you will talk about the results. For me, the results of my scientific research. For Pia, her books. But actually tonight, it will be much more about the process and the role that imagination plays, both for science and art. And I want to start actually, well, as you know, as Pete said, you know, working at an institution where was the home of Albert Einstein for so many years. I'm contractually obliged to start with an Einstein quotation. And actually it's one of my favorites. Einstein said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited to all we know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution." So I think tonight it's much more talking about what we do not know, what we could possibly research, what we possibly could create, and you know, what are the human qualities that are necessary for that. I want to start with a little anecdote. So, and the anecdote is about a Dutch chemist called Jacobus van 't Hoff. He was not just a chemist. He was the first person to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1901. And when he became a professor, the title of his inaugural lecture was The Role of Imagination in Science. So why did he talk about imagination? Well, the reason was actually he's a fascinating character. He was the first person to essentially discover that molecules are three-dimensional. And in particular, if your molecule, you take its mirror image, it will have completely different chemical properties. Like, for instance, any molecule in your body has a certain chirality. That is to say, has a certain handedness. Like, all our DNA is spiraling in one direction. If it would do in the other one, it would be totally ineffective. And when van 't Hoff published his materials, he was criticized. He was a young chemist, and the dean of chemistry was a German chemist, and he criticized van 't Hoff. And he said, and van 't Hoff at that point was working in the veterinary school. He said, well, this van 't Hoff, he will just jump on his flying horse and will fly to the high mountain and just decree how things are, instead of painstakingly deriving it. He basically took a leap of the imagination. And van 't Hoff was so hurt by that criticism that when he finally was a professor, this was the topic that he wanted to talk about, the role of imagination. So that's already more than 100 years ago. And van 't Hoff, being a scientist, took a very scientific approach to the question. And what he did, he made a list. He made a list of the 200 most famous scientists in history. And then he put them in 3 different categories. So the first was the category of scientists without imagination. That is no interest in the arts, you wouldn't go to musical performances or read poetry. The second category was those with imagination. So who are interested in the arts, who would go to art exhibition, go to concerts or read novels. And then he had a third category, which is interesting. It's scientists, in his language, with a perverse amount of imagination. So interest in alchemy, astrology, a lot of crackpotty things. And then he gives the list of those in the third category. It includes Newton, Leibniz, Ampere. All the greatest scientists are in that third category. So what do we learn from that? Well, my take on this is that Newton is, of course, a famous case. He's perhaps, the French astronomer Lagrange said that Newton should be the happiest person who has ever lived in the history of humankind. Because there's only one system in the world, and he's the one who has discovered it. So Newton, famously, he did his theory of mechanics, his optics and gravity, but then he went on to have grand theories about religion, about history, about alchemy. So he I would say, overreached. Well, I think actually personally, I think it's very understandable. If you're the first person to understand that there actually is a system in the world, that actually, as in his case, the moon orbiting the planet and an apple falling down are one and the same thing. If there really is a logical system behind everything we see, why not also behind history or theology or psychology? So Newton, I think, is the fact that his imagination took him far away from what was reasonable to assume in the 17th century. I think it's I never did karate, but I've once read that if people are hitting through a brick wall, that if you want to hit through a brick wall, you should not aim at the wall, but you should aim at a point behind the wall, so that your fist hits the wall with maximum velocity. And I think this is, in some sense, the role that imagination has. The way I see what imagination does, of course, it tries to visualize that we do not understand and see. So it's really what's behind the wall. There's a great metaphor of that science is like discovering what's on the other side of the hill. So you imagine you're in a landscape and you see a hill and you want to kind of guess or figure out what's behind the hill. And I feel there are two human qualities that allow us to discover this. One is imagination, which is in some sense the art to see things that are hidden, imagine things which you can't see yet. And the second thing is curiosity, which is the innate human quality to kind of climb the wall, climb over the hill, and actually go and look. Now, I think it's very special that we're talking about this here tonight, because clearly, for me as a working scientist, as I said, within our scientific circles, we spend very, very little time talking about this process. We'll share our latest ideas. We share the new theorem that you have proven if you're a mathematician, or a great idea if you're a physicist, or if you did a wonderful experiment. But how you get there, I think, is something that is kind of almost understood. And so I now want to relate it to my kind of personal path that brought me to science. So I was a typical physicist in the sense that when I was a teenager, I discovered physics, discovered mathematics. I discovered I was very good at it. But also that there was this wonderful world to discover. And for me, my family background, my parents didn't go to university. So for me it was books, a few books that were given to me by my teachers, books that I found in the library. And it was a great, wonderful experience to explore on my own this new world. And then I went to college and studied physics. And things kind of became very different because certainly the way I was taught, it was very important that you had a good grade for your exam. So kind of the studying for the test took over. And for me, in some sense, slowly my original enthusiasm for science kind of evaporated. I had wonderful grades, but I had like zero interest at some point. And at that point, actually, the two of us met. And Pia might say something more about it, but she saw this, I basically just finished my bachelor degree and said, well, you're a so-called physicist, but I don't see you doing any physics. The only thing you're doing was painting, because at that point, I started to spend more and more time in drawing and painting. And she basically encouraged me to kind of follow my passion, which at that time was clearly not in physics at all, and go to art school. So for me, going to art school was a revelation, because the way art is taught is anything but studying for the exam. In fact, there were no exams. There were no tests. There were no correct answers. I was very much encouraged to explore. I'd like to say, the end of the week, only one thing mattered, which was how high was the stack of sketches, materials that you actually produced. And we were very strongly encouraged to go out of our comfort zone. I wanted to be a painter, but I was forced the first years to do photography, ceramics, industrial design, and it was liberating. It was wonderful to go in these areas where basically you couldn't make a mistake. You only could kind of hold back, which actually was the worst thing you could do. And then something remarkable happened to me, that when I was in art school, I certainly felt liberated again to buy a physics book. I remember still very much the moment I went into the bookstore. I felt, wow, wait a moment, I can buy a book and read about physics. There's no exam or nothing. And just enjoy it. So then slowly this little ember of my proto-scientist started to kind of burn again. And then I had to make a very difficult decision. Do I want to stay in art school, or do I want to go back to the university and finish and go into a physics career? And I decided to do that. But I would say I entered physics in a completely different mentality. Not only did I look different, because the art school fashion style, this was the 1980s, was very different from those of physicists. But also, I think, a very different attitude. I went into physics and I said, there's one thing I want to do. I don't want to do any further exams. I want to do the equivalent of making sketches and explore. And so, in some sense, my personal story is that my detour going through art school actually turned out to be a shortcut. I entered the physics, my PhD program, like a researcher, which is very different from somebody who knows the correct answers to the exam. Because one thing as a research scientist you are confronted with, that first of all, it's not quite clear what the right questions are. And nobody gives you any guarantee that there is a right answer and what the right answer is. So you need very, very different skills. And so few of the lessons I learned from art school, I think I tried then to kind of apply in my own science career. For instance, this kind of exploring things, the fact that, the scientific progress is not so much a step-by-step, slowly moving forward, but often it's jumping into the deep and then trying to swim back to shore. It's a very different process, and creativity in a scientific environment, of course, very different from an artistic one. Now, the moment you put your pen on paper and make a sketch, well, first of all, you're doing something that's original, almost by definition. And it's not a matter whether it's correct or not. It's perhaps whether it's interesting, whether it's explorative enough. Of course, in science, in the end, there's logic, there might be nature, that actually reality, that what might push back. Now, there's this wonderful quote of Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, that scientific research is creativity in a straitjacket. You are confined by things. So, perhaps to finish, I want to say a few things about what I think, at least for me personally, has been effective role of imagination in science. And I want to say a few words about the role of metaphors. And I think that's for me key to what imagination is. Now, often, exploring things, I almost have this visual image that you walk around your subject and you're looking at the subject from various perspectives. And I think one of the great techniques in doing scientific research is looking at a problem, at a question, from a different perspective. And it's actually quite remarkable how the language of science, particularly of physics, is full of metaphors. Well, you know this if you just use an everyday language where you often use power, or even my title, The Power of Imagination, uses kind of a physics language. Now there's this kind of a famous example that's true in quantum mechanics, where, for instance, an elementary particle like an electron can be both a wave and a particle. So there are two perspectives. They are both correct. One might be more practical in answering one set of questions and the other in answering another set of questions. And in some sense, being a scientist is juggling these two different perspectives at the same time. There's a wonderful quote by Wolfgang Pauli, famous physicist, which was, I think, 2 weeks after Werner Heisenberg, the other famous physicist, discovered this principle of complementarity, or the uncertainty principle, the fact that both things can be true at the same time. And Pauli says, well, I think I understand. He writes this in a postcard to his friend Heisenberg. If I open my left eye, I see a particle. If I open my right eye, I see a wave. And if I open both eyes, I become crazy. And I think this is, for me, actually incredibly important principle how imagination works, this kind of shifting of perspective. I personally have a strong case of something, some of you in the audience might have the same thing, synesthesia. Synesthesia is a fact that you see colors, for instance, if you think of a certain letter or number or person, or people sometimes they confuse their smell and they smell a certain smell if they hear a tone of a certain pitch. So you're basically blurring your senses. And I think so for me, metaphors are always around the corner. I'm a very metaphorically thinking person. And I think this is a great technique to explore new perspectives on science, because I think often the really quest in scientific research is not so much of discovering a new particle or a completely new mathematical theorem. It's often a new perspective on an old question. In my case, what is space, what is time, these very deep fundamental questions. And I think, in some sense, art is a very good training ground, how to orient yourself. Now, in the kind of 19th century, art and science were very close together. And so many of us, feel sentimental about the good old days when this was all natural. But I think this might be mistaken. Now, I know there were cases like 200 years ago when a scientist made a discovery and would talk about this in an audience like this. They would spontaneously start to talk compose a poem, which is kind of would be really bizarre nowadays. And artists, in some sense, were trained to work very scientifically, with anatomical drawings. So I think this is, in some sense, an interesting but a very superficial connection. And I would actually premise that the much more interesting question between science and art is the vulnerable inside, the things that typically both disciplines usually do not talk about, the process, the fact that you often fail, the way you force yourself to deal with obstacles, the way you just exploring things. It's this kind of soft insight, I think, where the research, the explorative process, which is usually a very personal one, resides. I think that's where kind of science and arts kind of connect. So I think this was my opening. And it's quite interesting, Pia, that you're now in a position to give your perspective. So Pia is a novelist and I'm a scientist, so often we think together we think of ourselves as science fiction. So I think now it's a perspective from fiction. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for that nice introduction. No, it's so interesting to hear Robbert talk about his tour to, becoming the person I think he's meant to be, the art and the science together. And thinking about myself, being a writer, I'm preparing for this talk, it's think about the way I became, the tour I made and the detour, and it's not something that was an easy one, and it took a very long time for me to tap into my own creative vein and, be able to write. So let me tell you about a little bit where I started as a small child. I was this dreamy kid who really liked to read, especially with picture books. But this was not something that was stimulated or taken seriously as a career. But for me, when I went to college in the Netherlands, I wanted to study literature. And but the thing about, so in Holland, there's no general college, you just study your subject. So for me, that was, literature. And the thing about literature is it was meant, you look at it from a totally scientific view. So you study grammar and you the history and all the periods. And for me, actually, that worked, kind of stole my thunder, and I lost my interest in reading. And it was just overwhelming amount of kind of science, and I didn't feel connected to who I was. And I kind of distracted myself much all the time from my, my reading and what I really liked and why I started to study. And then, so that's where we connected. I met Robbert, and he was kind of, bored with physics, and I was getting depressed, I think, with my studies. And so and it might, also because we fell in love, but we discovered like poetry, I had poetry, and we did music, and then the painting. So suddenly, and there was a lot of different things. And I remember that I went to dance school, so there was this whole physical aspect. And I liked it so much, and it kind of opened up things for me. But I think I was more a shadow artist, so I was more, kind of, I think, stimulating Robbert to do things, and I still didn't connect with myself to do that. So I studied then psychology, because I thought this is a good thing to know about all the things in the subconscious of people. And I ended up as a management consultant, where we did, I did most of the time, analyzing in a company, the structure, and then it ended with training, and then was the last part that was coaching. And I really enjoyed the coaching of people, and I became very interested in the stories people told me. And of course, I was supposed to help them, but I was more and more interested in how they solve their own problems. And then I became interested in something called imagination therapy. And I don't know if any of you know what it is. It's kind of close to hypnosis. So you bring people in a slight trance, and then you find all the images that work for them and that steer them in their behavior. And this was so fascinating. It was so fascinating to see how people were stuck in their way of thinking and helping them, move their images so they could solve their problem and connect to a different narrative and get out of their problems. And so this kind of helped me, and it's actually the coaching was a good thing for me when we got children and I started working from home. And then something happened, and that's why my book is called Saving Charlotte, the Mother and the Power of Intuition. So our daughter was born with a very severe disease, leukemia. And we were told when she was born that she had no chance of survival. And that was, of course, that hit us very hard, and we had 2 boys at that time. And so I kind of intuitively, when we were at the hospital discussing what we should do and how we should treat our baby, and at that, she's 17 now, so all went well, but at that time the only thing that was available was chemotherapy. And so we decided to do nothing, to just take her home and treat her in the house with, all our, in the family. And so this was a whole year, it took a whole year for us to be with her, and thank God she went into remission and she survived this ordeal against all odds. But then I was just in a totally different life. I couldn't go back to my old job as a coach and a consultant because I couldn't listen to other people's stories anymore. And I wanted to, listen to my own. I needed to tell my own story. And suddenly, when she had healed and I didn't know what to do, something happened. I woke up in the middle of the night and I had this intense sense of me being in this space. And who was I after all this had happened? I was this was such a out-of-body experience. And I remember that I went down to my old office and I opened my fountain pen. I just made some scratches until the ink flew through it again. And I took like an old envelope and I started to write my name, Pia. And below it, I started to write the name of our daughter, Charlotte. And it was just like I came into myself. And I always found my name very strange, not fitting for me. But suddenly I felt, this is my name. And so in this middle of the night, I started to write, actually. I sat down and I just started to write, and I just couldn't stop writing. So after that, I went to bed, I had an hour of sleep, and this continued. And the next night, I did the same thing. And I just, something opened. There was a vein all of the words. And later I learned this is called the midnight disease. It's kind of they call it maybe a pathological way, but for me it worked really well, a way of connecting my brain, my body, and my pain. And so I couldn't stop writing, and I collected all the stories that apparently were inside me, and it was so much, and it made such it helped me so much to, you know, to feel myself, to get into myself, and open up all these creative images and stories that were inside me. And slowly but certainly, this ended up in stories and books and children's books. And this is the story of how I became a writer. And and now I think I really live in my subconscious world all the time. And I go into my zone when I start writing, and I just kind of go inside where all these images are. And sometimes I use the techniques of imagination, so I bring myself into a light trance. And so it's really like opening up this vein, and it's like, instead of the ink, it's my, you know, my blood, you know, flowing into the page for my readers. So this is my story of my creative journey.
Well, I think we're both eager to start a conversation with you, but perhaps we can kind of start with two of us. So, Pia, I want to ask you, now if you talk about imagination, you know, whether you could say a little bit more where it's coming from, because in some sense it's, certainly, you know, you write fiction often, so you could think, well, you can make up anything. But often, I mean, if I kind of personally observe it, it's more like you're discovering things that are already there than that you actually are creating them, you know, in a completely artificial way. So you feel it's coming from something, or just making things up?
Yeah, I don't think many writers make things up. You always find something inside. I feel it like it's mining my unconscious. And the way it works is through the senses. And I think that's why I became more or less depressed when I was studying you know, literature. I didn't use my senses, so it's really smell and touch and you know, feeling. And I have, you know, around me, I need to have like my favorite smells and stones, and listen to music where I listened to when I was a little kid. And so you have to, I think it works only through the senses. Yeah.
So one thing, of course, which often is seen as a difference between art and science is that, as I said, you know, science is about something objective, so it's out there. You can't make it up. If you try to, then, you know, reality will hit back. So it's really more discovering than inventing. But I think actually, no, I've witnessed, for instance, you writing novels. And so it's kind of interesting because, you know, if you're married to a novelist, you also get this extra company with all these fictional figures that start to, you know, and a novel takes many, many years. So I've been living for many years with your fictional characters, and we would discuss them. And what they would do or not do, and if you're halfway the book, then in some sense they're already fixed. So this is, I find, quite remarkable, because it's almost like that these figures become real. And so do you have a sense that, you know, that actually the things that you imagine are real? The characters in your novel are real?
Oh yeah, I think they're totally real. I don't feel like I make them up. I think they find me and they want me to tell the story. And if I'm writing, I'm just always thinking, what are they telling me that they're doing? So it's, the book writes me. I mean, this is a cliche, but for me it works. And I did one book where I got a stipend to write a book, and then I had to deliver a whole construct for beginning to end and the plot and everything. And it just, then I started to write, and I tried to do this whole plot, and it just didn't work for me. I cannot, you know, I'm a person, if I write, I figure out what I want to say. It's a whole different way of doing. And yeah, these people are real for as long actually as I'm writing the book, but afterwards I kind of forget about them. So you reminded me of some character in a novel, and I really had to think like, oh yeah, so when the book is done, it's there. It's for the people who read
And
it.
there's the opposite effect. So that if one writer once said, if it really happened, it's not an excuse, in the sense that, if you have a terrific story that happens, it doesn't make great literature, right? So in some sense, often I feel art is almost more real than reality, because it's a more condensed form of reality.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, I think you net reality need net need reality in a way so people understand it and can learn from it and yeah, so you do something with reality, and I think that's the art of writing, and that's the hardest part.
Perhaps before we turn to the audience, there's another point which I think is, both of us struggle with this, and perhaps many of you do too, which is really, I think, the difference between kind of passive and active enjoying something, right? So in my case, it was like learning physics and taking tests and solving problems on your exam, versus actually creating the stuff yourself and being kind of part of it and living, being an active scientist, which is very different. And you had the same thing with literature, studying books and getting a more scholarly approach, and then actually doing it yourself. Are there any kind of tips or hints or anything that you want to share, or how to kind of jump in and be kind of an active artist or scholar?
That's something that's very important to me. When what I started to say is, you just don't become a writer, and it's very intimidating when you are either young or you just kind of you want to go into a certain field. That there are all these people who are accomplished and they have done things and they write poems and they're in the New York Times or the New Yorker, and you feel like, who am I doing this? And that's very you shouldn't let yourself be intimidated by the perfect outcome of people who do that, but you should try to get to your vein and what's inside you and then put it down, and I think perfection will come later. So for me, I always see people, it's also with music, you shouldn't be intimidated. The fun of making music is so big. You're never the best pianist in the world, but you still could have fun with it and do it and be good at it and find your own way. So that's a big lesson. I think the whole thing about, for me, studying literature is like, it's so intimidating that you study about these accomplished people like, years ago, another century, and you think like, oh, I will never be as good as that, but it's not about that.
I must say, once, I don't write as much as Pia, but I write a monthly column in the Dutch newspaper about science, and one wrote a column which was 10 rules of success for a working scientist, and it became quite popular. And by the way, the 10th rule was ignore all rules. So, but I can share a few of them, which I think actually have some grain of truth in them. So one of my rules was, force yourself to, as a scientist, to like go to a conference or a talk or something that you find totally uninteresting, you feel 100% certain is of no relevance to you and your interest. Just force yourself to do that. Say a few percent of your time. Another rule was that if you see a $20 note on the floor, pick it up. Because I think this is actually often I see with young scientists. Now they think of something, and I remember I was there, and I think, wow, I have this brilliant idea. But obviously, this great physicist would be, he could finish the whole project in 5 minutes, and he hasn't done it, so it must be a stupid idea. But actually, even very established scientists, and I think could just not have the idea. Now, one thing I find absolutely remarkable, I've seen this many, many times, is that a young person would come, and exactly the point you were making about, oh wow, there's all these grand figures and all these established works of art or scientific theories. What can I add to it? And a young person comes and looks at this whole edifice and say, well, it's obvious this tower is missing or something. They immediately see what is there, what's possible addition or what. And I think that's a remarkable phenomena, because you might think that at any stage We are like at maximum capacity, you know. All the great minds are working together, and we have the best ideas, and how can you possibly add to it? But I think, you know, there's something, certainly in science, there's a lot of kind of air. So whatever is the knowledge right now, future generation will compress it to something much smaller. And then there's lots of space to add to it. So there's this remarkable phenomena again and again, that the new generation is able first to kind of basically understand what the previous generation, with lots of effort, was able to derive, and then add new stuff to it. So this is quite remarkable. I think in art it's the same thing, that you might think, well, all the great minds have written the most wonderful books, but you can add something or create something, because this is infinite space to kind of explore.
Yeah, and the other thing is, there's never, nobody's in need of another book, so that's might also be very depressing. Nobody needs a new painting, nobody needs another work of art, or nobody needs another poem. And still, if you make it, you add something to this world, which is a thing of beauty, is a joy forever. So I think if you still, you know, find this way of expressing yourself, I mean, it's worthwhile. I really think so.
We can't see anything, by the way. We're both blinded, so I'm just staring in a black hole.
Very strange.
I see the candles, that's about it. But I know there's a moderator here that at some point want to involve the
I can
audience.
re-emerge and we can start taking some questions. Please go ahead.
So thanks so much for this discussion. It's been very interesting. I was very interested to your remark, Robert, about the common trait between, thank you, yeah, between the scientific discovery process and the artistic expression. And so what is actually really unifying the two aspects is the process itself. And this is actually what is last talked about and thought about as well, which might have to do with the complexity behind it. And so my question would be, what do you think is the language to discuss the process that be unifying human knowledge and how this ultimately might be very well related to the sheer difference between different wiring in the brains and consciousness?
Well, that's a very deep question. I think perhaps the shortest answer, there isn't yet such a language. It's kind of remarkable in some sense that, 100 or 200 years ago, people were more inclined to discuss, at least. I think particularly, on the science side, we became very kind of professionalized. So it's almost, I have never had these discussions, only like in settings like this, at a conference, late at the bar, people might share this. And I think we are very much in need of a language. And for me, actually, if anything, my little detour through art school and art almost gave me more the tools to describe it. Because I think I would actually, I would state that, within the art education, in some sense, certainly in the last few decades, I think the weight is more on the process than on the outcome. I think there's no more, I think like in the old days you would have drawing lessons and who could make the most anatomically correct drawing of the musculature or something. That would be like a perfect grade. And I think art moved away from that. It's more about the process. Although I think it's still, to a large extent, intuitive. And I think artists too feel very almost scared to talk about the process because it should be hidden in the thick mist of uncertainty or something too. Because otherwise, you remove, in some sense, the mystique of it. And I think there's no mystique there. I think there's actually something you can learn. I think, certainly in science, we spend less than 1% of our time and energy about the process. I actually learned a lot from just observing, so to say, the masters. I think that's probably the way it's, often I think that's the case. And you see, certainly in science, certainly in physics, there's a huge repertoire of anecdotes, how the great did this and this and that, and something you slowly make out of this. I think we're in great need of both developing a language. You're correct to point out that the wiring of our brain probably is very important how this process works. So I think actually investigating it might actually enable us to be much more creative and imaginative. But I think also it's not only need a language, I think we need formal training in this. And my point of view is certainly, I think, in science, where doing difficult computations probably be something that more and more is taking over by computers. That actually this part, imagining things that aren't there, is something that is our strength. And if it's our strength, we should kind of train for it. Often I feel we are scientists, probably in 100 years, people look back in how scientists work these days, as we now look back on athletes like 100 years ago. There's no training, no diet, nothing, just went with what they felt was good. And now, of course, it's done in a much more professional way.
Sure, go ahead.
So to maybe come off this point, one of the things I read once is that metaphors, machines cannot do metaphors, and metaphors are all too human. And so in some ways, I think we need to preserve what you're saying, so we need to preserve the human ability to do metaphors. At the same time, that is something we need to teach machines to do somehow. But apart from this, my question is different. So I'm interested in the connections between you two. Not on a personal level, perhaps, more of on a professional level.
Yes.
So recently, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has commissioned a British-based organization to come up with a handbook for climate scientists on how to effectively communicate the messages of the IPCC reports they produce, which is something that should have really happened 20 years ago, and it's only happening now. Because basically most of the IPCC documents remain something that only scientists and researchers can read. And so this report, now this handbook is out, and it's using all sorts of things, but mostly visual images, to guide climate scientists in describing what they do. So whether an image that shows a person building a photovoltaic is speaking more to people than the photovoltaic itself, rather than the person's actually doing it. So my question is, what is that you've learned from living together in terms of how you communicate the outcomes of your research in a way that people understand you? And I mean people, not scientists. I mean people that do not, citizens, if you ever had to do that. And how her practice, how Pia's practice has influenced you, and whether you think this, your practice has something to teach to science.
Want to start? Shall I start?
Yeah.
Curious. Well, it's many different. So I think let me start with the communicating element to it. I must say, something through my other interests, I know more about IPCC than I wish to know. So I can say a lot about this idea of non-communicating and why it was like that. But I do a lot of public communication, of public outreach. And one thing I learned, and I think this is something that immediately relates to what I've learned about writing. Because, writing is a very strange way of communicating, because it's, you write a sentence, and I feel it's almost like you take reality, you condense it to something very intense, like a concentrate. And then that actually is then transferred to the reader, where it gets dissolved again, and then it has to recreate the experience that the writer has. So from this, I really learned, and I think has been guidance for me, that certainly in communicating science, engaging science, the starting point is, so to say, the reader or the viewer, the audience. And it's about starting at that point and then bringing that person to the fact or the science, which actually is very much about how research works too. You know, I think you don't start with the electrode. You start what you are thinking. And so the scientific inquiry is a process where you, as a scientist, find your way, often in a very complicated way. That's why we talk about the whole creative process, to get actually to the result. And I think exactly the same thing happens on the part of the public or the reader, because it's the same process. You have to find your way to that insight. And so one thing I learned from is, and certainly I think, reflecting on what I feel is the standard practice within the science world, is that that path is walked exactly in the opposite direction. I think most communication starts with the results and then try to find a way to the audience. Well, I think it's actually what you need is the opposite thing. So I feel, in some sense, the process of communicating and sharing your insights is actually very, very similar to the creative, explorative process itself.
Yeah, what I want to add to this is when I was just telling about our daughter who was sick, and we made this, we got these results of like 35 children who had the same, it was kind of myeloid leukemia, and so and the treatment, and we're sitting there in this doctor's office with this newborn in my lab, and I just had this intuitive insight to just leave. And people always ask me, what about Robbert? I mean, he was a scientist, and did he look at it from a different perspective? And the beautiful thing is that people always think like scientists look at this from a scientific point of view, and they don't use their intuition. But scientists, what I learned with Robbert, they are just all intuition, because they're used to science is a scientist is used to, like, they only understand like 95% of what's there in reality. So they're used to kind of be in this space where you don't know. And I think that's where we connect very much. There's not like the scientist facts and making conclusions and me being intuitive and have no clue. I think it's very close. And I think there are many misconceptions actually about scientists.
I think I really recognize this. I think, as I said, the creative process is really about everything that hasn't been created yet, right? So, but of course, there's this wonderful image of Borges about this kind of library that contains all the books of like 400 so many pages, and only a fraction of them have been written. So you basically, as a writer, you confronted with this infinite space that's yet not explored. And I think the science exactly the same thing. So as any scientist here will recognize, it's all about what we do not know. It's all about this kind of big unknown. And forget about what you do understand. That's kind of boring in some sense. That's already covered. So I think what we share is this focus on the great unknown. That's this wonderful image of Newton that which I think he was might have been an awful person, but I think he was very true to himself when he said at the end of his life he felt like a little boy playing on the shore, picking a nicer pebble. Very conscious of this infinite ocean of the unknown surrounding him. I think that's I think the feeling we both have. It's just like this infinite ocean of words you can compose, of facts that are things that you can understand of nature, and I think that's where we live.
Yeah, so that's where we find each other, I think, in mining these unconscious. Yeah.
Maybe at the back there. Wait, there's the microphone.
Yeah.
So I was struck by your description of your imagination process, that it was a very sensory thing, that you were sort of sensing these characters when you were creating them. And also when you were talking earlier about imagination therapy, how people sort of had to be put in a light trance, sort of stop thinking so that they could then access their imagination. And I just was wondering, like, almost from a psychological point of view, how do you view imagination? Is it just like it's there always, whether you're thinking or sensing or intuiting, or like how do people look at imagination?
Oh yeah, okay. I think we are steered by these images that we have in our subconsciousness, and we just don't know it. And I think we have to access it. So I think that's the challenge, I think, for all of us, how to access your subconscious, how to mine these images, how to change them if needed. And so of course, we all have it. You just have to know what it is. And so, I mean, and to make it maybe a little bit more concrete is, if people ask me about this imagination therapy, I give this example of people. I mean, I had one person, and this is a very common thing. People have a burnout, and they feel like they're in a tunnel, and they cannot get out, and then you bring them in a slight trance, and you kind of try to let them play with this image of a tunnel, and you say, like, how does the walls feel? And then you sort of, maybe there is like a window, and they say like, no, there's no window, and then you maybe look at the other side, and then suddenly they find maybe a curtain, and it's a little bit open, and there's a flash of light. So you kind of play, you have to play with what's inside you, and you have to find access. And the beautiful thing is that you don't have to go through all this difficult, mind's scientific things. You just have to relax and close your eyes and then be open to what's in there. And for some reason, nature and all the things I just said, like smell and music, it's all ways to help you open up and get to this unconscious. And then you will be surprised how much is there. I mean, that's what happened to me in retrospect when I had this, what I just call this midnight disease. It was just kind of this vein was opening. It was like, oh my gosh, I have no idea. This was all inside me. And then the other beautiful thing is like, oh, and there's a way to get it out there. And for me, it was by words. For other people, it might be by science, or you might paint. But you have to find your specific tool. And yes, it's always there. But you can block it out, of course, push it away or whatever. But it's always there. Yeah. And it's steering you.
If I can add something to it, because in that sense, my world is slightly different. Because I do a lot of like very abstract mathematics, and of course, if you imagine people and situations, you have your whole life experience to feed that imagination. If you're certainly in the more abstract areas of science, you first have to, fill some sense the unconscious. So part of my routine is to clearly read a lot. Sometimes you become very familiar, for instance, with very austere mathematical objects. But then for me, at some point, they really get a character. So I can kind of almost dream about them. For me, again, since I mix my senses quite easily, it's literally a soup of colors and mathematical symbols, and I think of certain objects almost like physical presence. It could be a 26-dimensional space, but I feel almost like has a certain character. And so the remarkable thing then in science, of course, is if you see where science is dealing with, it could be elementary particles or complicated molecules, it could be the structure of the universe. None of it you have ever physically experienced. None of us have actually met an electron and felt it or something. So what we have to do is then somehow artificially get a sense of familiarity and the same ease with you manipulate people and situations and emotions. I have to manipulate these much more abstract things. And I think what I see certainly with great scientists is that they really get this kind of intense sense of character almost of these physical objects. It's, as we said, when we're discussing one of your characters in a novel, we'll have a discussion about, well, this person clearly never existed. It only exists on your pages. But it has a very strong sense of what he or she wants to do. And, you might have said, well, this person might, do this and this kind of action, but at some point you feel, no, he's unable to do so because the logic of the character forces you to do so. In the same way, I think, certain mathematical objects have an internal logic, and you get to know them. You almost get a sense of what they could do or not. So the remarkable thing, I think, of the scientific mind is that you can feed your imagination with things which are far, far beyond our everyday experience. And think that, I find it absolutely wonder that the human mind is able to travel into these domains where it clearly was not shaped. And I think, our billions of years of evolution trained our mind to understand perhaps human interaction and scheming and whatever, but not how elementary particles work or galaxies or molecules. But the thing is, our creative mind is such that we can kind of live in that sphere and be as creative and as imaginative as we can in everyday life. And I think it's a remarkable sign of the flexibility of our minds, and perhaps in some sense a sense of the universality of physical or human experience, that we can travel into these domains. But I think that's a remarkable thing that actually works, that actually there's such a thing as scientific imagination. I think is a remarkable fact by itself.
More questions? Maybe right here.
Thank you so much. I think this is a very interesting conversations you're having with us. I really appreciate it. As Feynman said that, there is, sort of a straight jacket that has been put on in science. Do you think, I think we have become, in terms of science, has become narrow and deep, and forgetting the other aspects like Pia was talking about, the things that are also outside of the physical context, because physics and other scientific issues and concerns have become very physical, the physical universe. And science has done tremendous job, in the last century, lifting, coming up with all inventions and so forth. It hasn't enriched humanity as a whole. But is it at the cost of something else that's so beyond us, and the scientific method may not be applied? Are we constraining ourselves into not looking at the other space where Pia is looking and mentioned earlier? Or does the scientific method also can be used in terms of as a process for this other thing, sort of for the ocean instead of the pebble that you talked about?
So I start? Well, that's a very rich question. The question is, essentially how much space is there for imagination, right? I mean, that's, and I think a very easy thing to say is that space is becoming smaller and smaller. I think, there are several processes here. I think, first of all, I think science itself has become a little bit, it has professionalized. So it's not about what a particular person wants to investigate. It's whether you get a grant, whether it all fits in a big scheme. Lots of people are getting involved into what scientists should do, governments, companies, etc. So I think the error bars are shrinking too. I think we are allowing less variation. And you say, well, with narrow and deep, I think actually the risk is narrow and shallow. Even diving very deep is difficult these days. It's, if you spend many, many years underwater, so to say, and before you rise to the surface, your granting agency might not be happy to it. So I think that's one. I think also the natural connection between sciences are the various branches of science and scholarship are getting more difficult because the distances in some sense between fields, I think, are getting larger, and the architecture of the whole scientific building, I feel, where we build more and more walls, isn't helping. But there's another thing which I think you're pointing out, that some science itself has become narrower. For instance, both philosophy and history of science have been almost kind of dropped out. They were much more naturally part of it. So, and I see this often, I think, particularly with students, I feel that they are almost objecting to this very, very narrow view of the discipline. And I think on top of it, there is something which is really, I think, very detrimental to science itself, is that it gets divorced from art, from the public discourse. So it's becoming more and more hidden, I feel. And I think this is, by the way, extremely dangerous. Because it's, by definition, I think science is becoming, of course, it's more details, it's more difficult to understand. and I think it's removing itself from society. But on the other hand, it's extremely powerful. So we might, in the end, be in a situation where we are hardly able to communicate what's happening, but yet, the scientific enterprise and technology is governing our world. So I'm not sure what to do about this, but it's, as you say, I feel personally that if we broaden the discussion, not only from just not focusing only on the outcomes, this is the latest drug that we developed, or this is the latest machine that we built, but much more about this process, what scientist discovery is. And I think our premise is here that process is much wider than just science. We see it in art, you might see it in different roles. I think you will have an interesting conversation. And one thing I notice whenever I talk about this, about the fact that I feel as a scientist that society is constraining us, is in some sense almost limiting our imagination. That this sense of being boxed in is not only something that scientists feel, but it's something that educators are struggling with, politicians struggling with. I think the whole society. I think we're getting more regulated, and there's almost like a lack of oxygen, I feel. And perhaps part of, and I think what science can do is definitely present itself in the full breadth that I think science should have and has, where I feel the arts are at least a good partner in crime here. I think they're suffering something in the same way, and I think if science presents itself much more aligned with the arts, that element, the creative element, imaginative element, becomes more highlighted in a stronger fashion.
Yeah, and just want to add something we discuss all the time is that if you're a scientist, it's all very organized, and there's all this path you can follow, and then you become like a professor, a tenure professor, and there's postdocs, and so there's a whole way of it's all structured in a certain way, which has its limitations. And on the other hand, there's the arts, and like, for instance, I'm a writer, there's nothing. I mean, with a little luck, you can somehow get somewhere a stipendium, some money. But in the other, there's nothing. You just have to figure it out for yourself. And if you did a successful book, you have to do another book, and you have to, so there's no rules. And I think...
No structure, right?
There's
no structure, no support structure, very little.
There's no support structure. And so Robbert was in Holland, was the president actually of the Academy of Science. And it used to be the Academy of Arts and Science. So my thing is that it should go hand in hand. And I think especially when science is more kind of narrower and more specific and more specific, even more specific, they need more arts to get out of their, narrow mind of thinking. I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think you need a balance here. So Pia makes a good point. I think the arts often, I feel, are completely unprotected. So you need something of an outer shell. I think you need some protection from reality, whatever, to fully feel free to explore. I think this is a good thing of science. There are universities, there are research institutions, there are grants, and everything. So I think the arts need something of that. I think actually the scientists might have too much of too many walls and be boxed in too much, I think. So I think both can learn from each other. And in some sense, I think in previous times when, of course, it wasn't such a big deal, it was only a handful of people who were in a position to be either a scientist or an artist, that language was much more common. I think that was a good thing. And I would love to us go back, but then in a new way, to this kind of romantic era, like the early 19th century, where I think there was very natural discussion between the two.
Another question. I think you've had your hand up a few times.
Thanks. Okay, so this is kind of a long-worded question. Do you think that this idea that creativity is the realm of art and not of science comes from either these social constructs which have forced science to be sort of more productive than for the focus to be more on the productivity rather than on the process? Or do you think that creativity is sort of just a realm of art because you can show a product for your creativity, whereas in science, the product of your creativity is just this sort of ethereal idea that you had on what the correct question is to ask and why it's relevant and how to properly test that question. Yeah, so whether it's from the social aspect that's applied to science or from the actual essence of creativity.
So one thing I find remarkable that, and I'm not an expert in this, but I find it striking that, again, I started my talk by this kind of anecdote, from a Hoff who talked about the power of imagination. I think that was in the 1880s or something. It's remarkable in the 19th century, if you have the great mathematicians like Poincaré or something, they all wrote about the creative process. They wrote thick books and they were bestsellers about what it was to be a creative scientist. I think in some sense that's much less common now. Now there's a lot of popular literature in science, but it's about how do black holes work, not about the process itself. So I think it's probably, and again I haven't studied this, but I think it's probably due to the fact that after the war, science became this huge construction, and with rules and regulations and huge amounts of money, where we felt less confident to talk about the fact that there is this very vulnerable and creative process that it's no guarantee of success, etc. And so I think that element, and also the fact that the scientists, there's been this kind of bifurcation. I think it started mid-19th century where the word scientist came to being. That didn't exist before. Actually, the Anglo-Saxon world is really hampered by this. Like, for instance, in Dutch or German or something, there's just Wetenschap, Wissenschaft, which includes both, scholarly work like the humanities, etc. But so it's scientists, it's the technology element to it, and I feel this is somehow a self-reinforcing stereotype, where this more creative part, which is absolutely essential. I think if you talk to working scientists and say, well, who do you admire? It's always, you have the admiration for the people who actually are masters in that art of finding new ways. That's the thing that we were all enthusiastic about, not so much about the results. And so it became almost like a hidden world. Well, I think in the arts, that actually became really front and center. So apart from that, I think it's necessary for a sort of correction. I think it's a relatively recent phenomena. I find it kind of remarkable how this was a very active topic under scientists, say 100 years ago, and now I think it might resurface again, by studying our brain and etc. But it somehow became almost a topic that you do not talk about in public.
Yeah, we've been thinking about this also a lot. So I think it's the whole world of science has become so specialized that you feel you can only talk about a certain subject. If you have studied in that certain subject, you're not allowed to say anything, a word about anything else if you didn't study that. And that's too bad, because we are all, I think, this, homo universalis person. And so Robbert was actually doing a show on the mind of the universe, and he was filming this, and he was talking to all these people, and in the meantime he was just kind of in our home in Princeton we have Einstein's piano, which is very interesting, his grand piano, because he used to, he played the violin, and he used to, Thomas Mann lived across the corner, and they played together, and they didn't feel intimidated, like, oh, there's whatever beautiful orchestra, and I cannot play like that. And Robbert was actually, on this piano showing, this is how Einstein was kind of thinking, and he thought his big physics idea while just kind of jotting on the piano. And somebody said, like, how dare you play the piano if you're not like, this famous
You're
pianist.
Not Andras Schiff, I think.
Yeah.
That was the...
And I was thinking, that's very strange that people take away from, it's like this poetry, they take away the joy of just simply, writing poetry and
Well, that's the point I also
Yeah.
just made, between doing something active and passive. One thing I really had to discover, so for instance, for me, it was totally eye-opening when I was a young graduate student and I went to my first kind of scientific meetings, and there were the great heroes of my field. And I was, listening to their conversations, and the conversations were like, oh, didn't this work? Like, what was his name? And they couldn't think of any equation. Anything they said was essentially wrong. They didn't know any of the background. They were just, this was like, wow, they're failing all the exams permanently. And then this was a completely messy conversation. And then after 2 hours, certainly there was a new result. Where did that come from? And I felt, wow, this is actually how it works in practice. It doesn't really matter whether everything you say is absolutely 100% correct. You can figure that out later. It's just finding your way, and you not hampered by too much knowledge.
So this
so
is
to
how
say.
writing starts. First you make a mess.
Yeah, it's a very messy process, and you should feel okay, because it's just do you get to the other side? I think that's essentially what you want to do. So, and I think that's you learn in practice, but it's very, very different from this highly polished image I think that people have. If you ever see a scientist portrayed in a movie, somebody standing off the blackboard and the right all, it's totally not like that. It's a very messy thing, and in the end you try to straighten it up. And as a famous saying is, any scientific article is written in reverse chronological order, right? It starts with the end.
Maybe if we have one last short question. Oh, someone way up at the back there. Let's get you.
First of all, thank you so much. This is so fascinating. So I have a question. I'm curious. How do you feel your more analytical scientific background has influenced your personal style, like your aesthetic, the common themes, language, things like that? How has that influenced your more creative pursuits? Or would you say it's not really influenced by the scientific background, but more like inherent disposition or human experience or something like that? So, and also not just for you two, but just general, broadly, like the Renaissance thinkers, the left brain, right brain, intersectional minds.
I should start? Okay.
Yeah.
So the easiest part for me is to answer how, I would say, some more artistic side influenced my more scientific side, I think. Because I think that's kind of easier, because I'm a kind of very intuitive thinker. As I said, I have this hyperactive urge to find metaphors. So, which even if I write something, there's like a metaphor in every sentence. I think that's, I'm searching now for the metaphor to explain this phenomenon. But as I often said, I have metaphora nervosa, and I always kind of. So I think that actually, that great part I see very much in my kind of science. I'm always trying to connect two different topics, and now sometimes I walk into the office of a colleague and I see certain things on the blackboard, and I say, oh, that's wonderful, A is connected to B, and he said, no, there were two students, first want to talk about A, the other about B, they're not connected. I always want to connect. The other way around, I think that's it's an interesting point. I think actually there is a certain what I learned from the scientific process is that in some sense it's like almost you do a calculation. You first get one digit and then you add another digit. It's an approximation. That's very much what science is. Of course, science is there's not absolute truth. You explore. So this idea, which I think is crucial to everything in science, that you get the first order effect and, okay, get half right, and then you get another half of the half right, and then slowly you converge to. I think that's something also, when I think about art, I think that's part of it. But if I'm completely honest, I think there's more life in art. And I think, science it's as I said, it's really esoteric. You have to move into areas which are very far away from your intuition. So I almost feel like it's like doing a deep dive. And what you need a little oxygen, So for me, I think it's the art that allows me to dive deep in very abstract mathematics and kind of still able to breathe.
Yeah, I want to just add one thing. So the way it works with us, that we both really need to, fill our senses with, going to see art or look at pictures. And I think that's a very big part of our day, to get inspired and not just listening to the news and the everyday issues in politics, because they can be all-consuming. But just try to step away from that a little bit and see images and do that kind of stuff and read poetry.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's a very important point to make. That one thing which is, for me, and I think for you too, is extremely helpful in triggering your imagination. Not only to experience art or listen to music or read, but also to see artists or scientists in my case. If I'm really at a dead end, often I start reading a biography of somebody I admire, or you go to an art exhibition, and it's almost that you feel, wait a moment, there's other people have found a way, and that inspires you. And I think that's a remarkable thing, that there's something to the creative process that is kind of universal, right? You recognize it in historical figures, in completely different fields. You might read about a composer struggling, 4 centuries ago, and it helps you solve an equation in quantum mechanics. That's a remarkable thing. So there's something universal there, and I think we both recognize this, but it's also very nice to recognize that in others.
Pia, Robert, thank you so much. And to speak slightly metaphorically, thank you for sharing so much of your journey with us all tonight. I think we all appreciate it enormously. Let's thank both of them. And thank you, the audience, and for your wonderful questions. As I said at the outset, this is the first of our Chasing Consciousness season for 2018 for Y House. Some of our next talks, we have one coming up in March and then again in April and May. We're covering topics as diverse as science fiction and robotics and quantum computing and the history of science and the role of artisans and scientific method. So I hope you will consider joining us for some of those events. You can go online to the Y House website. And I believe even this week we have some more events coming up on Wednesday. I think if someone will just remind me, we have Consciousness Club this Wednesday. This, again, you can find out the details online. That's at our space, which is down on 28th and Park Avenue South. And I believe the topic there is going to be philosophy. And Pete, is it this week that you're at the Rubin Museum? Next week. 21st. Okay, 21st of February, the Rubin Museum has a series of events, and one of those, Pete Hutt, who you heard at the very beginning, will be on stage discussing, I believe, what is the topic?
The topic is time.
Time.
There is a Buddhist specialist, and I am the physicist, and together we talk about time, the nature of time.
Okay, so if you didn't catch it, the nature of time, a discussion between Pete, a physicist, and a Buddhist expert. So that promises to be extremely interesting. Thank you all again. Let's thank our speakers once more and have a good evening.